Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk about religion in the world today of the internet. Now, channels like The Critical Drinker and the little sub-channels around him have been talking with a degree of glee about the fall of Star Wars, how Disney has destroyed Star Wars, and then you have Marvel fatigue, and then there are other channels that talk about streaming services in big trouble. And this all makes sense. There's sort of been a frenzy of storytelling. When I look at I have a certain number of streaming services that I use, and when I look at those streaming services, I'm just aghast at the amount of new content that is being produced today. That on top of movies, streaming TV, etc., etc. Apparently, there's a big collapse about to happen with respect to streaming. And that collapse has everything to do with sort of the failure of the movie model, sort of pushed on by COVID. The enormous costs that streamers have been, that big properties in streaming have been undergoing. So let's start with the streaming crisis.
Streaming felt like a pretty unbeatable deal. It was often ad-free and much cheaper than cable. And the libraries were pretty impressive too, with all sorts of studios and distributors filling Netflix's catalog.
Now libraries is an important word here. These are libraries of content.
And at least in the US, multiple TV networks and cable channels putting their shows up on Hulu. Back then, it really felt like it was possible that anything could wind up on those services. Today, that model has changed completely. The early 2010s dream...
Now, there's something to be noted here about the creation of a lot of these kinds of videos that I have been watching myself watch them, and even videos from friends of mine. Part of what I think make these videos so popular is that usually, again, partly because of the way YouTube copyright algorithm works, you can show a lot of little content, visual content from major Hollywood movies without the soundtrack, just little clips of them, and we see these familiar faces before our eyes. And we see familiar scenes, we see shows that we like, and these people, because they have been before our eyes, they feel like our friends. And so to make a video like this, you just keep dropping familiar and beloved faces in front of people, and then you have your background comment, and then you just sort of... So then sometimes I watch these videos, I decide I'm not going to watch these. I'm going to close my eyes and listen to the content, listen to the narration, because obviously that's usually the value added that's been given by Critical Drinker or how many of these other videos.
Theme of almost everything the average person would want to watch being in one place is long dead. And there's probably no better example of that than Disney Plus.
Notice all the quick, all these Disney people. Oh, these are my friends, these are my friends, these are my friends. Now, of course, this isn't what's being said, but this is what's being felt by certain members of our Consciousness Congress.
Itself. Instead of being a big, broad service that has something for everyone, it really specializes in a few of Disney's big brands, especially when it comes to producing originals, which heavily...
And when we have these sort of iconic scenes like the Woody, I think I didn't see that particular Toy Story, but I recognize who the people are, or Star Wars, or Captain America. Suddenly these things are playing on inside of us.
And Star Wars. And even many of their productions outside of those rely on old Disney IP, from High School Musical to the Proud Family revival. Now, this is a little less the case outside of the US, where Hulu barely exists and tons of FX shows are accessible through the service, a bunch of movies, but it's pretty safe to say that the big brands are its bread and butter. And they're hardly alone in that. Look at a service like Paramount Plus, which has really doubled down on Star Trek and Yellowstone. Maybe more than any of the others.
Now I mentioned the whole business side of this because it's not disconnected and it's not unimportant.
Those two seem laser focused on a few of their biggest properties. It's an understandable strategy, as big brand names like this can cut through the constant noise and actually get some attention.
And actually with a lot of these videos, the better ones actually have pictures that relate to what they're saying. Some of them, I mean, I've seen some critical drinker videos where I think he's just got the trailer and he's just bombarding us with the sequence of images from the trailer. And then, of course, you have the laughing guy and the message, all those kind of things sort of interspersed in it. But for the most part, it's nice when they actually have something that relates to the point they're making in the video.
Something it's increasingly difficult for new shows to do, but it also comes with a pretty big downside. Like, sorry to state the obvious here, but the MCU and Star Wars are known as film franchises first and foremost.
And that's important. Okay, film franchises. So this is something that maybe you went to see in a theater. Now it's coming to you on a remarkably competent television set. Maybe it's OLED or something, and maybe you have surround sound or something like that. But again, you might be watching it by yourself. You might be watching it on your phone. But this stuff was originally designed for movies.
And any shows that they make in those universes at least have to try to reach some kind of movie-level visuals. Modern Star Trek also seems dead set on looking a lot more like the J.J. Abrams movies than the old shows. And what all of that adds up to is fairly short but very expensive television. The days of Star Trek The Next Generation or Enterprise running for over 20 weeks a year is very far behind us.
Now, this duration, where I'm going, because I know where I'm going with this video, sort of, and y'all don't as much, is, so I'm a minister. We run 52 Sundays a year. Bible studies will run maybe most of those weeks, except 2 or 3, or all of those weeks. And so we're doing things regularly. We're sort of providing a universe in which people can inhabit them. Now, with streaming services, if you go back, just this weekend I watched some videos about why movies in the 80s, 70s looked like they did, and why in the 80s they looked like they did, and why in the 90s. One of the things that you note with those decade-long things is that technology changed some things. So I grew up in the 60s when I could watch things on TV or I could go to a movie theater. I remember when I was in college, the VHS came out and we could go and rent movies and watch them in our dorm rooms or in our apartments after college. And then I went overseas, and even in the Dominican Republic, in the little town that I lived in, there was a video rental place, which the Dominican Republic could be hilarious sometimes because things like copyright laws, not such a big deal. But for a lot of people, again, depending on sort of when they were born, you see these Star Trek Next Generation people. I look at them and I don't have a big attachment to them. I'm not sure quite when Star Trek Next Generation came out, but I think it was when I was in college or after college. So that I watched a lot of TV sort of up until, high school, through high school. As of course I got a driver's license, I began watching less and less TV. I could go to movies then. I could go out with my friends then. I could go play Dungeons and Dragons with my friends then. We could do a variety because I was a nerdy kid, so we played Dungeons and Dragons. So but then my television watching sort of trailed off. And in college, I was quite a bit busier. Hardly anybody watched TV in college. If you did watch TV, it would have had to been sort of a group thing where there are a couple little shows like after school. Somebody was watching, there was this anime cartoon with a spaceship, the Yamato battleship in space, Star Blazers or something was showing. And, at certain time we would sit around in a dorm room and just yuck it up with, and then Voltron would come on. So we would just have fun as college students sort of mocking these things. But we weren't seriously into this kind of stuff. But we would all go out to see the Star Wars movie, let's say. So VHS was just starting to come onto the scene. But then, of course, after college, there was seminary, and I still didn't watch TV. And then I was overseas, and then suddenly life slows down. You have kids, and so then, watching some video content with my wife, let's say, renting movies from the video store down the road that had pretty much just had all bootleg, pirated movies that were cheap, bad copies filmed on VHS that the local video store would rent for pennies, basically, because even at that point now, in some of the poorer neighborhoods, people were getting televisions and then VHSs, and then they could watch movies it'd usually be dubbed into Spanish, maybe they had subtitles, so on and so forth. But all of this has to do with sort of the character. So I was never a next generation person because I was too old. But then as generations go by, you have these generations who become sort of next generation people. And then the question is, well, how do you interact with these stories? And that's where sort of the rise and fall of streaming and whether we're going to have piracy sort of make a new comeback or what's going to happen with this. It's technology is a part of this story, and storytelling and fandoms and all of this is a part of the story.
Instead, a show like Star Trek Strange New Worlds will run for 10 episodes, and some Star Wars shows, like The Mandalorian Season 3, is only managing 8.
And this is where you begin to get sort of the movies versus serials. And of course, these have older paper analogs. You had novels, and then you had these novellas like Dickens that would come out serials in the newspapers. And so even the structure of this isn't necessarily new.
And after those very short windows, many subscribers are more than happy to save some money and cancel the service until next season. All of that builds into a problem that haunts almost all of these services, from Disney Plus to Netflix to Peacock and basically everyone else: subscriber churn. Where 10 years ago, many...
And this, of course, I talk about churn in YouTube. I look at, even my own audience, and, the overall numbers, I put out a ton of content, no surprise there. And putting out a ton of content is probably a bad strategy if I want to grow a YouTube channel really big, because in some ways I just sort of accelerate the churn. Now, some of you have been with us for quite a few years. Some of you are just kind of new in. You'll churn out. And as a minister in a church, this isn't something that I'm unaware of, although churches are far more sticky than this kind of video churn.
Many would be happy to just keep their Netflix subscriptions year-round. The sheer amount of big streaming services has encouraged more of a revolving door approach, as subscribers sign up, watch the thing they wanted, and then cancel, and maybe subscribe to a different service for a while instead. With the sheer amount of services, and the prices on those services constantly going up these past few years, of course many people are going to opt for doing just that.
And prices are going to go up because the point that they're making is that, well, there's an attention economy here, and there's an attention race, and everybody is sort of playing in the attention race. And this is all, of course, wedded into an entire ecosystem now where the internet is ubiquitous via our cell phones, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or YouTube or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever the kids are using these days. There's this churn, and all of these images, all of these stories, all of this increasingly weaponized, perfected, refined, mobilized, attention-grabbing, story, world-shaping, forming stuff is just leveling up.
But for Disney Plus and the others, that means that the subscriber number, the thing that's always measured their success, just doesn't mean quite as much as it used to. It ebbs and flows.
And that's, well, see, because YouTube, it doesn't cost anything to click subscribe to a channel, then you begin to notice, well, it's very interesting. So there are some channels with multiple times more subscribers than my channel. I've got more watch hours. I've got more video hits. But they've got more subscribers. And so one of the things you learn very quickly with YouTube is that that's a subscriber number. It tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything. And there are websites out there like Social Blade that you can sort of dissect the analytical numbers on other channels, and you can sort of compare, well, sometimes see what's going on. Oh, car's still there. Nothing in the parking lot. No. you sort of figure out, what's going on with these things?
And of course, almost all of these big services have lost money, usually a lot of it, with Disney Plus reporting well over $1 billion in losses last year.
And of course, Disney, as a major corporation, can absorb that. I was having a conversation about YouTube, and somebody was saying, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, but I mean, YouTube isn't here because it's necessarily terribly profitable. YouTube is here because Google doesn't want anybody else getting everything that YouTube has to offer Google.
Now, that was always part of the plan, lose money for a while to make a lot of it in the long term. And they do seem better positioned to do that than, say, NBC Universal's Peacock, which is still struggling to gain subscribers. But it does seem like the days of these companies being okay with stomaching massive losses is quickly coming to an end.
And of course, this is also happening at the same time where you also have this arms race in terms of production, where things are cheaper and cheaper to make, but yet at the same time, you're still competing, even though everything is cheaper to make. And some kinds of things are cheaper to make, like special effects, but then we begin to notice that, a really well-designed costume is a lot better than some CGI green screen crap.
With many of them, including Disney Plus, having to resort to mass layoffs. Basically, with streaming services on this scale, there's one massive problem that they can't get around. In the words of a consulting service quoted by The Hollywood Reporter, gone are the revenues enjoyed during the cable TV era, which formally approached those of the global energy sector. By some estimates, streaming generates 1/6 as much revenue per home as pay TV.
Wow.
In addition, audiences are fragmented, canceling subscriptions is easy, content has only become more expensive to acquire and produce. I think that, more than anything, is what...
And of course, they're always sort of finding a new content, a new story, something new that will grab, which is why they just sort of keep going back to old stories. More and more Disney, more and more this, more and more that.
What lies at the heart of Disney Plus's problems. As easy as it would be to narrow things down to the MCU Phase 4 being a disappointment, or the Boba Fett show being terrible or whatever, the issue with the service is just so much bigger than any of that. It's that the Netflix model, the model that services like Disney Plus grew out of, just isn't a profitable one, especially when so many are attempting it. To quote that article one more time, rather than being the new sliced bread, investors and executives have accepted that streaming is, in fact, not a good business, at least not compared to what came before. A common complaint I hear is that these large streaming services are becoming more and more like cable, and there's a pretty good reason for that. Cable television actually made money. If you want to read the whole thing, I'll leave a link to that article down below in the description. But where does that leave the future of Disney Plus? Well, obviously, I can really only guess, but I do think we have some indications. Since its inception in the US...
Well, don't have to worry. I'm not particularly worried about the future of Disney Plus. I don't subscribe to it. I don't care about it. But what we're probably going to see again is more price increases. And for a while, another video that I saw talked about the fact that for a while, Netflix and sort of staved off pirating, but it could very well be that pirating will once again make a comeback. And it's ironic that in the digital world, basically pirating is part of the equation to keeping streaming cost bloat at bay. But now this really isn't a video about the economics of streaming versus movies versus anything. It's a video about the formation of people into a religious worldview. And it's also a video about the undoing of the modernist definition of religion, because it's just increasingly difficult to not recognize that religion is ubiquitous, that Harry Potterism is a religion, and that lessons can be learned about God and the Bible by looking at J.k. Rowling, because in that little universe, She is the inspiring spirit that writes the Bible, which is the Harry Potter books, which are themselves a library.
I didn't have internet at all when Philosopher's Stone came out. So around about 98, I did have internet, but would use it to look stuff up, like most of us do, and I would use it for email. But I think some sort of unconscious spirit of self-preservation had stopped me going and looking at Harry Potter, till the point where the internet fandom cropped up in interviews, and I thought, well, I need to know about this because I'm...
Okay, fandom is a really key word here, because fandom is something approximating, not really church, because church is way too instantiated, but fandom is basically something approximating what pollsters would try to get at when they would figure out, are you a Christian? Fandom has much more to do with identity.
I can't be ignorant about this. I need to know. Well, I mean, I went online for the first time. And I just had no idea. I just fell into this universe.
How deep into the fandom are you?
Very.
How many times do you think you've read the books?
10 to 15 times through the series.
Okay. Part of the really wonderful thing about this podcast, and it's a terrific podcast, I really encourage you to download it, listen to the whole thing. It's really very good. Just so these books, they're paper. You buy them once, you can read them as much as you want. You can pass them around, you can share them, you can get them out of the library, you can probably get them at a thrift store or used bookstore for almost nothing. But these books now basically formed the children. Mayor Harrington, I think, does a really nice job at upper and lower register stuff in this piece. But it makes sense that we should have arrived here, for the history of the Christian church is also the long history of its slow death on the cross of matter. We can't separate the history of Christianity from that of scientific modernity, which is to say, from our trajectory away from enchantment and into the material world. It was movable type and the proliferation of Bibles, then the spread of literacy, and thereafter the break with papal authority that opened space for the first stirrings of modern natural science. With that science came to a steady withdrawal of God from his creation, first per Descartes, into mechanistic principles, and finally, per Nietzsche, from widespread observance altogether. Killed by our own hand, in the space left with our murder of God, Nietzsche claims we may now attempt to create our own values, and if we can, to live by them. These shifts have consequences that reach far wider than individual ruminations or small provincial churches. For as God was given to or been sacrificed for science, so money and congregants have drained away and moral authority has departed from them. The story, she sort of sets up a subtraction story, and of course it's far more complex than that. As I read at the beginning of Vatican I, you have this tremendous spike of Catholic interest in the 1860s. And now a very low resolution version of history would say, well, didn't the French Revolution kill the church? Well, it sort of subdued it, and then it pops up, and then it goes down, and then it pops up, and it goes down. So there's a lot going on here. Where the Christian moral grammar once forced the common structure within which other religious outlooks were more or less tolerated, Christians are now a minority within a framework that has adopted some of its ideas, but is overtly hostile to many of its beliefs. And this is where I think Mary Harrington would have a very interesting conversation with Tom Holland. But this point that she makes here about the printing press, again, it's not a unique point, but it's critically important, because suddenly what the Harry Potter books did was in many ways afford its readers an enchanted universe to live within, and they could read the books multiple times.
Series?
And I just had no idea. I just fell into this universe.
How deep into the fandom are you?
Very.
How many times do you think you've read the books?
10 to 15 times through the series.
The magic came from the first book, and there was just no turning back.
You got to fill this stuff with those little songs, don't you? It's just because it's probably a very successful way to do it. If I had little musical interludes like Grim Grizz does, You remember Embody, the little Chad commercial, all those things. Grimm's back on the internet, so that's a happy day.
I'm Megan Phelps Roper, and we begin today in Orlando, Florida, at LeakyCon. LeakyCon is one of dozens of Harry Potter conventions that are held around the world every year.
Okay, so we are at LeakyCon 2022.
And now this is important. It's important for this little corner. We've got our May event coming up. It's important for church. We have live events every week in our space, and churches spend a tremendous amount of money creating space and creating events and all of that. And over the last 30 years, there's been vibrant conversations within churches about these kinds of events and the actual output that they do. That's, again, I think part of what's happened in Protestant world is Protestants get very pragmatic and they ask, okay, do worship services change people? Do we have to sort of put on an event? Do we have to deliver an experience?
22, and it is pretty packed.
I've been a fan since, I think, 1998, so I really grew up with Harry Potter.
And like many of these events, it takes place in a convention hall filled with a bunch of people who are dressed up as characters from the books.
And that is not incidental.
Well, I'm dressed up as Buckbeak today, and I'm here with my husband, who's Sirius Black.
And then we have our witch hat.
And if I am very confident that J.k. Rowling has performed weddings for people within the fandom. I'd lay money on it.
And our wands.
I have my own prescription Harry Potter round glasses.
They sell handmade merchandise, they have meetups, and they even get tattoos.
The fandom is, of course, a religion that you inhabit, participate in, and live within.
It's like my first childhood memory.
And how many Harry Potter tattoos do you think you've done?
Way too many to count.
And when you ask them, a lot of these fans are quick to say that it wasn't just Harry Potter that brought them together. It was the community they found surrounding it.
A lot of the community here at LeakyCon, they were my friends growing up. We were all online.
Specifically on the internet.
I think Harry Potter is so special because it was coming out right when everyone was getting online.
Harry Potter, which would go on to become the best-selling book series of all time, just happened to be published right as many people.
Now, the best-selling book series of all time, you have to remember that every time someone talks about the best-selling book of all time, the best-selling book of all time is the Bible. They always exclude it from book lists because even today, it mops the floor with everything else.
Were getting their first introduction to the internet. And so there is a generation of people who grew up alongside both the characters in the books and the ever-expanding power and influence of this new technology.
Pretty much as soon as I got on the internet, somehow, at age 12, I must have Googled Harry Potter.
In fact, for many fans, Harry Potter was their gateway to the internet. It was the first thing they ever looked up on Yahoo or Google. It was their first email address.
We were able to talk to people from around the world and meet people that have the same interests as us.
It was their first time talking to another person online. The first time they made a screen name.
I was going to mugglenet.com every day to get the updates, talking on message boards, writing fan fiction on fanfiction.net. And it was such a special experience to get to connect with.
And of course, for a lot of parents, it's like, you want to go on the internet? No, the internet is a scary place where there's predators and porn and all those. No, I'm just going to go to MuggleNet. Oh, okay. It's just like going to Vacation Bible School.
With so many people who you didn't know necessarily, but who felt the same passion for Harry Potter.
One of the things that I think you have to understand about Harry Potter is it is one of the biggest fan experiences that modern culture has to offer.
Experiences is a very interesting word. Now, you've just heard the voice of Helen Lewis, who had a video with Jordan Peterson that's even more famous than the one that he did with Kathy Newman.
This is Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic, where she writes and reports about politics and internet culture.
At its peak, there were people writing hundreds of thousands of Harry Potter fan fiction stories. So taking the characters from Harry Potter and writing your own stories for them.
And have you ever read a Gnostic Gospel? Have you ever read, in the wake of Christianity, in the centuries after Christianity, unbelievable amounts of stuff was written. If you follow Jonathan Peugeot's Universal History, I mean, in some ways, all of that is partly connected with, let's say, Harry Potter fan fiction or Star Wars fan fiction.
I was equally fascinated and alarmed, if I'm honest.
Rowling says that when she saw the way her books were colliding with the still quite new internet, much like her reaction to the book's surprise success, she was taken aback, but also really intrigued.
What connections did you see people specifically, making with the books?
Well, there was the really sweet sorting of yourself into houses, which I think speaks deeply to children and also to adolescents.
Are you wearing yellow because you identify as a Hufflepuff?
Yes, 100%.
There was...
Now, what strikes me about this childhood formation, intentional childhood formation, is that people are aghast at, you would raise your child to believe to basically accept the parents' religious beliefs. That's child abuse. Here, read some Harry Potter. Same thing.
Obviously, the championing of different romantic combinations, which was very sweet.
Why Hermione and Draco?
Because who did not want the bad boy?
We can change him.
Yes, that was everybody's fantasy, right?
Little groups of mutual support were made. Real friendships were made.
If you ever want to feel good about the world, go search the internet for friendships forged by Harry Potter. There are so many places where fans are just gushing. Like one user says, "My best friends in high school were a group of people I met because we loved talking about Harry Potter online. I'm so happy that I'm alive at the same time as the internet."
Now this is very much happening with Star Wars, happening with just any of these franchises. Oh, this is the Critical Drinker video. This isn't the other one. Happening with where's that new generation? There they are. Well, all of these images are religious icons.
I watched it happening. I could see really beautiful interactions happening online. And, in later years, I met my best friend on MuggleNet. My husband and I connected over Harry Potter.
We are wearing our matching shirts from when we got engaged, and we had a complete Harry Potter wedding where we wore house robes instead of tuxes.
And believe you me, if they could have got Rowling to perform the ceremony, they would have done it.
That's happened time and time again. And it's just a beautiful thing. So huge positives came out of that.
The biggest of the early fan websites was called MuggleNet. It was set up in 1999 by a 12-year-old homeschool kid in Indiana who could have had no idea how much...
Of course it was a homeschool kid.
...this site was going to change his life. And that's partly because Rowling eventually embraced it. She was one of the first authors, the first creators of any kind, really, to invest time and energy communicating directly with her fans online.
She learned from Jesus. Yeah, grab Peter, make him, the rock upon which I will build my church.
Doing interviews, answering fan questions, really catering to the community she saw forming there. But she also told me that, on at least one occasion, she went into one of these forums anonymously.
So I chose a random name that was not a Potter-related name. I was almost scared.
This is a great story.
Even though they've all got Potter-related names, that I would choose a name that was a little, I don't know, I was just scared I would somehow self-reveal. So I go into this chat room, and people are sharing some theories, and I gave an opinion that was very black.
What if God were one of us? Just a slob like one of us. See, Grim, I can sing on TV too. Looking to make his way home.
And I got rounded on by users who told me in no uncertain terms just to get out. I'm not familiar in that room. I'm clearly an idiot who doesn't know anything. But I genuinely, I left. I left.
You ever have a theological doctrinal debate?
And I was thinking, do you know what I promise you this is what I thought. I thought, I've written 3.5 books, I think it would have been at that time, where bullying is such a theme from the very first page, where bullying and authoritarian behavior is held to be one of the worst of human ills.
Okay, now again back to the video I made first. I mean, this is a sin that Rowling is building into the narrative, that this is a sin. And what you can do in one of these worlds is show that authoritarianism, bullying leads to bad outcomes. I'm not a fan of bullying or authoritarianism, but it's built into the moral fabric of Harry Potter's world.
And look what just happened. And these people who call themselves such fans of this franchise, what if I'd been a 12, like I didn't care.
Right.
I was a pretty robust person.
Right.
But what if I'd been some 12-year-old who's excited to go into this room?
In other words, the fans who are formed by this world can't even live the morals of this world. What does that say about human nature? It's not in any way surprising as a Christian minister that this is the case.
And is immediately, caustically chastised for not belonging. Just kick someone out because they're new. And I thought that was so interesting, that you're passionate about these books, and yet in the course of living, you are behaving in a way that I depict as one of the worst and most dubious human behaviors.
This being the early days of the internet, it was also the early days of a kind of social behavior that we now generally know as trolling.
There were definitely individual trolls on the MuggleNet forum.
Now, it's very interesting, too, the development of language and language for sin. So trolling, of course, trolling always has two senses. One is the troll under the bridge, and the other is sort of fishing trolling. You sort of lead people along into where they don't want to go.
Purely there to be objectionable.
And even though they were just this small part of the community,
it was a fringe, but it was definitely there.
Rowling noticed that they did seem to have outsized power.
At first, I thought it's kind of amusing that this is how you're spending your time, but as time went on, I started to really see it as bullying. There was an edge of picking off vulnerable people.
In other words, even in a universe created by the god of Harry Potter world, j.k. Rowling, who writes the sacred text to be everything against authoritarian bullying, these dynamics still emerge. Shocking.
And I was very aware by that time, early 2000s, that a lot of kids who felt themselves to be outsiders, who were vulnerable, were finding themselves in Potter.
They're finding themselves in Potter. I don't know how many Christian songs and liturgical and theological languages we find ourselves. What does the Apostle Paul say? I mean, you have the kingdom of God in Mark and Luke. You have the kingdom of heaven in Matthew. You have eternal life in John. Throughout Paul, it's in Christ. So, in other words, in Harry Potter.
Why do you like Harry Potter?
He felt like an outsider and he felt like he didn't belong, and that really resonated with me.
Like, I had not such a great childhood, and I think a kid with not such a great childhood actually escaped to something else in a book.
Many of the people that like Harry Potter tend to be the ones outside, especially if you're a child that isn't well loved.
Wow.
I felt protective of those people, so watching trolls operate in those spaces.
Joe Rowling is looking on from above.
Increasingly did not amuse me, it began to concern me.
Both of us had challenging, crappy upbringing and childhoods, and when you talk to people that are like the really crazy fans, that I feel like that's something that comes up more often than not.
And I think Harry Potter was one of the things that was just always there for people.
You grow up feeling like the weird one of the bunch, but then you realize there's so many other people out there like you, and then you don't feel so alone anymore, you know? So that's the best part about Harry Potter.
Now, what's difficult about this is that you can sort of create, and of course Peugeot has made a good point about it, you can sort of create a community of the excluded, but if the only thing that your community actually has in common is being excluded, you don't really have a community. And so then sort of Harry Potter comes in and becomes that glue around which you sort of imagine you can create this. But, going back to the question of, well, why is Star Wars imploding? How can this universe be going away? Well, what is this universe built on?
Harry Potter. And indeed, I actually ended up in long-term pen pal relationships with some of those people. I can remember a situation where a young person had written a letter that
Prophets
resulted in my then assistant and I calling that child's school. We were very, very concerned that this child might be about to kill themselves. I just was hyper-aware, and I remain hyper-aware, that the Potter books were a refuge for some people who were, for very different reasons, very vulnerable.
One of the groups that really gravitated both to the Harry Potter books and to the online fandom were gay teenagers. The president of the Human Rights Campaign, the largest gay rights lobbying organization in the U.S., once referred to Rowling as a writer whose work has inspired countless LGBTQ young people to imagine a world of acceptance and inclusivity.
Now, those of you who are old enough can remember that, well, there was at one point a crisis because there didn't seem to be enough gay representation in Harry Potter, and so then she declared that Dumbledore was gay. But everybody was just kind of like, huh?
Were you surprised by the way that gay teenagers in particular really started to connect with the books? Did that surprise you at all?
Honestly, it didn't, because the amazing thing about the wizarding world is you walk through that wall in Diagon Alley. And while human nature remains the same, and that's something that I was setting out to depict, human nature remains the same. If you can do magic, the ludicrous things that we discriminate about in the Muggle world really are utterly immaterial.
What do you think?
Now, that's very interesting, because remember what I said before about, let's say, if the thing holding you together is marginalized, you have a question of, well, that's not really a thing to hold you together. That's a negative thing. And almost exactly the same thing has to do with, let's say, sexually marginalized, LGBTQIA+, whatever, because all of that is only held together not by a specific thing, but by the response to a more central thing. This, of course, is Jonathan's tweet from, Twitter didn't say what year that was, probably a couple years ago now. If you want to build a civilization, you cannot do so with the words like dark, rebel, or heterodox. By using these identifiers, you can criticize existing systems effectively, but you will never build anything of value and coherence. And this is exactly part of the difficulty that marginalized groups have. And then it's Harry Potter. But she said, well, if you can do magic, well, but you're not going to avoid a hierarchy, because now it's going to be a hierarchy of magicians. And so we're going to have Harry and Ron and Hermione, but of course Harry's going to be the strongest magician, and he's going to have the strongest magic. Now there'll be differences between them. Of course, that's how you get a team being stronger than the individual, but off you go.
Were the messages in your book, the misfits, people who felt like outsiders, what messages were they connecting with?
I think that some of the most sympathetic characters, like Lupin, for example, who, is stigmatized through something that he can't help, can't control. Some of the most sympathetic characters are people who are grappling with things that may be stigmatized. Mm-hmm. And they're all imperfect. Harry has anger issues. Mm-hmm. Ron can be, I think I call him a git quite a lot in the books. But together they are more than the sum of their parts. Together they grow. They find family in each other. And there's real human beauty in that, I suppose.
And so all the major threads of what we've seen in sort of the Western social conversation, I mean, she's, as I mentioned in the last video, I mean, she's really a product of it. And now she's basically giving it instantiation, putting it in books, giving this group a Bible. They find the internet, and off we go.
The Dursleys are my epitome of a very authoritarian and conformist world.
Okay, so we can create something that's against Harry's guardians in the Muggle world.
That demands absolute obedience. And that's not the world you enter when you go to Hogwarts.
Our grade in school.
Now it's really helpful to remember that Hogwarts is not a safe place. If you, let's say, so Harry's Muggle life out in the world, okay, he's oppressed by the authoritarians, etc., but you don't have trees and dragons and basilisks and Voldemort hunting you down. And so this is some of the complexity of the fantasy enchanted world, in that there's going to be a body count, and not the body count on the way that, you know, the at whatever channel has body counts.
Was the same year each book came out, so my exact class
that demands absolute obedience.
Now this next comment from somebody from the convention was really important, because basically people got to grow up with the books.
And that's not the world you enter when you go to Hogwarts.
Our grade in school was the same year each book came out, so my exact class was almost grew up with Harry. Like, we were 11 when Harry was 11. You know, as each book came out, these characters figured out a lot of normal life things right along with us.
Many fans credit the morals of the books with helping shape their morals growing up.
Friendship and loyalty and bravery and doing the right thing when the right thing is hard to do.
The way people pull together, they're different. They don't all exactly agree with one another, but they can say, okay, this is the common good and this is what we're going to work for. We need a whole lot more of that.
And as they got older and went from middle schoolers lined up at the midnight release parties to young adults heading off to college, some of those morals also became more mature.
Things like media literacy, understanding when maybe the media is lying to you, and having to really think critically.
To many of these fans, Rowling became something of a moral authority in their lives, giving them this series to grow up with and being this figure that they could look up to.
I idolized her for a really long time.
She was a great feminist icon.
Online, we called her Jo because we felt like we were on a first name basis. I think a lot of us actually kind of feel like she was our mom in some ways. She was just the mom of the Harry Potter fandom.
I became aware that I was, to an extent, becoming an idealized figure, and probably an idealized mother figure.
And this is a big deal.
And that is a complex position to find yourself in. And for me particularly, it's complex because I am a maternal person. It's not that they're seeing something in me that isn't there. And I have had quite maternal relationships with some individual fans who have been going through bad times. But to be idealized is not something I want. I am a human being. I couldn't have written these books if I weren't a human being and aware of human frailty and human imperfection. And I'm very aware that idealization comes at a price.
Again, I mean, I'm hot taking on this thing, but this whole podcast is excellent, and Rowling shows herself to be very smart and very right about a whole lot throughout this thing.
Last summer, in a grand celebration of literature, Harvard Square and Harvard Yard was transformed into Hogwarts Square.
Isn't that interesting?
This summer festival celebrated the midnight release of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows.
I want to talk about your 2008 commencement address at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, you are about 10 years since the days you were struggling in that small flat. You had become one of the most beloved authors of all time, and you're speaking at the most prestigious school in America, arguably the world.
Her books have set sales records and have won many awards, probably because the Harry Potter stories provide a familiar backdrop for readers who can empathize with the young protagonist adrift in a sometimes cruel and challenging world.
And so at this point, for better or for worse, you do seem to be seen as a moral leader. And the person who introduces you says this actually.
In addition to her vast contributions to literature, she is also noted for the social, moral, and political inspiration she has given her fans. A notable philanthropist.
And it's a remarkable thing to go back and watch.
And now I give you Ms. j.k. Rowling.
You're up there, dressed in robes, standing in front of this generation that grew up alongside Harry Potter, and you're talking to them as they are launching into the world.
The first thing I would like to say is thank you. Not only has Harvard given me an extraordinary honor, but the weeks of fear and nausea I have endured, crucial importance of imagination.
And your speech is very personal and vulnerable.
Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that became the solid foundation.
You tell them that they need to be empathetic to people who are not like them.
Unlike any other creature on this.
Empathy. Empathy. Now, empathy for so many people has become this key virtue. And this really picks up on C.S. Lewis's comment about unselfishness versus charity. C.S. Lewis from The Weight of Glory. If you ask 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 of them would reply unselfishness. But if you asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied love. You see what has happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive, and this is of more than philological importance. The negative idea of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I do not think this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has a lot to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. If we are told to deny ourselves and take up our crosses in order that we may follow Christ, and nearly every description of what we shall ultimately find if we do so contains an appeal to desire, if there lurks in most modern minds the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it is a bad thing, I submit that this notion has crept in from Kant and the Stoics and is no part of the Christian life. Now, when you elevate empathy, notice that there's in some ways two dislocations. One is you've made it primarily an emotional category, not an action category. I feel for you. Well, the book of James has things to say about that. Feel for you, but I don't care to do anything actually for you. But I really care, even if caring doesn't mean I actually have to act.
On this planet, human beings can learn and understand without having experienced. What is more, those who choose not to empathize enable real monsters, for without ever committing an act of outright evil ourselves, we collude with it through our own apathy. We do not need magic to transform our world. We carry.
And that point too, although it has a point, you know, if the Nazi prison guards were too apathetic to go to work, probably would have been an upgrade.
All the power we need inside ourselves already. We have the power to imagine better.
And the crowd just goes wild. They love it. And they love you.
Now, of course, all of this in the earlier episodes, and you really come to big things in episodes 6 and 7, is setting up the fact that she has them feeding out of her hand. She has written the Bible for a new generation, and it's complete with the children's materials. No church required, and it's made her fabulously wealthy. It's just win-win-win all the way around.
But at this point, it's really hard to imagine that you would be welcome at Harvard at all, or that you'd get that kind of reception from that crowd.
And this gets into the point that, well, we all were together about what we were opposed to, which was lack of empathy. Now you're a number of steps removed from actual love. And what held us together was being marginalized. No, what held you together was the group that was marginalizing you. Now take that away, and actually this haunts, ContraPoints will come through and have a lot to say, and ContraPoints is very smart. But this point about, okay, when you listen to someone talk about the world that they would want, and for ContraPoints, there's no longer any stigma, there's no longer any, and it's like, have you really thought through what that looks like? And if in fact it's achievable, would you want it?
In that crowd.
And what I want to understand from your point of view is what changed? And maybe when did you start to notice it changing?
I would say about a decade ago, I started to become very interested in what was going on online and concerned about what was going on online. I noticed a real shift.
We'll be right back.
Stupid commercial, but I'm going to leave it there. And of course, listen to the whole thing. Now, Jordan Peterson's release today, Parental Trauma in a World of Gender Insanity, Miriam Grossman, is really a rather, I haven't gotten all the way through it, but it's a rather remarkable conversation. Now, the conversation starts poorly because Jordan doesn't let her talk enough at the beginning. And but then he corrects about 12 minutes into it, and she's able to sort of reorient it and bring to the conversation what she really wants to say.
View with you is to give those people a voice. There's a whole population of individuals, and I'm speaking here, people have already talked about the detransitioners, and you had Chloe Cole on, which was amazing. But I want to speak about a different population, and that is the parents of these young people who have fallen into, I'm going to say, this darkness and this confusion. These parents are traumatized, and let me just tell you a little story.
Okay, now let's go back to the point about marginalized, traumatized. The parents are traumatized. The children are traumatized. And what almost never happens is that in this big rush to say, well, we've got to prioritize. We're against hierarchies, but we have priorities. It's like priorities and hierarchies kind of connected. And her point is going to be these parents are traumatized, siblings are traumatized. If the whole point of if the thing that keeps you all together is trauma, you're not going to be able to make any progress, because in a case like this, the supposed solution to the distress of the child is causing trauma to the parents. And you're going to have to prioritize something along the way. And obviously you're going to hope that whatever solution to one group won't cause problems for the next. And so there's all these implicit hierarchies in there. And she was a very compelling guest.
A few years ago, I joined a support group, an online support group of parents who were new, whose kids had recently announced that they were the opposite sex or neither sex. And there are these private Facebook groups and other groups that parents attend, and they generally are anonymous and they have to be vetted. And there's this huge process that they have to go through that takes weeks and weeks in order to get the support that they need. because our profession, the mental health profession, is not giving them, our profession is demonizing them. So they have
demonizing,
to go.
you're saying demonizing the parents who are concerned about what's happening to their kids on the gender education front?
Yes, the parents that will not immediately, jump into affirmation and that are feeling very strongly that this is not, the real issue, that the real issue is that the child has underlying trauma or autism or anxiety or what have you. The real issue may be that the family has had a lot of, there's been crisis or there's been losses or deaths or COVID or what have you. And the family is saying, look, my child is now saying that, that they're transgender, but I really feel that there's other things going on here. Mm-hmm. Why are you immediately giving us a referral to an endocrinologist for blockers and testosterone? And those parents are traumatized because, well, they're traumatized for lots of reasons. Okay, let's list their traumas, and I have a whole chapter about this in my book. Because honestly, Dr. Peterson, I am so troubled by how these parents have been treated and are being treated by the mental health profession, by the medical profession, by the media.
Yeah, well, the most common problem that I've seen emerge out of that is this. So the American Psychological Association announced in its guidelines for gender-affirming care that there were no valid long-term studies of the psychological consequences of transitioning. And
it goes from there. But anyway, the point is you can't, being traumatized, being marginalized, I mean, this is basically Peugeot's point. That is an insufficient foundation to actually build anything upon. And it's why these groups always fall apart, because once you take out, it's just like the NBA with the whole pull the chair trick. If you're in the paint and you're sort of tussling with each other, looking for space, one of the easiest ways is to, somebody's leaning on you, just quickly pull back, down they go. Well, that's what happens to these identities. You pull out the thing that they're creating their identity upon, Peugeot calls it parasitic, and flop, down they go. And what you actually need to figure out is, well, where is a solid thing upon which we can build? Now, in some ways, these stories have been instantiations upon which people have built their worldviews, and a lot of the values that j.k. Rowling put into her Harry Potter series are good values. But you notice how they get appropriated, and then when it becomes sort of a parasitic engagement, they then are subject to fast collapse. And of course, the whole podcast is about the fact that, on one hand, what people feel is this terrible sense of betrayal, that it's very much a religious deconstruction. And what I saw in this as it develops is that, in the same way that, let's say, Christians who have had traumatized or traumatic or deconstructed upbringings in the church come to hate God and suddenly talk about it as source or universe or something like that, the same thing's happening with Rowling. And in some ways, they just basically, I'll keep Harry Potter, but I'll divorce you, Joe Rowling. And it's like, wow. These patterns are pervasive and they're durable. So that's the point I wanted to make with this. I hope to engage more with this podcast. It's pretty amazing. It's an amazing podcast. So take a listen and leave a comment. Let me know what you think.